All right, welcome everybody to our GIS After Dark session. I'm Jerry Miller. I'm Associate Program Director for the GIS program at Johns Hopkins University, and I'm joined by one of our faculty colleague members, Jim Blanchard, Dr. Jim Blanchard. He's going to be our speaker tonight in this series. So just a little bit about these series. First of all, usually Dr. Cassandra Hansen facilitates them, and she's traveling. She's away this week, so I had the opportunity to step in. So it's a pleasure to be here to be speaking to all of you. And Cassie is going to resume facilitating them moving forward, of course. But usually these sessions, they're designed for sharing and presenting wonderful, innovative work that is taking place either across our curriculum or in general in the GIS industry. So very often we have some of our faculty come and present. We have external stakeholders and collaborators present. Sometimes students present work as well. So it's very much a mixture of presentations and sessions and topics. We'd like to keep these very much informal conversation also as we go along. Certainly ask questions. So there's a chat that you can kind of have a rolling commentary going on. There's a Q&A with formal questions and answers. The way we're going to run this after this short opening, Jim is going to share some of the wonderful topics that we have here at hand. So we'll talk a little bit about AI. We're going to talk a little bit about laser, and so is the intersection, a mixture of a number of different things that are super, super relevant here, especially within these last couple of years. So as Jim is talking, we'll let him finish the presentation, and then we're going to address any of the questions that you guys have in the Q&A or in the chat that come up. We'll have an informal conversation after Jim's presentation. And a little bit about the GIS programs in general. So we of course have a GIS master's in GIS at Johns Hopkins University, a master's in environmental sciences as well. So we also have now a dual certificate. We used to have it, that was sort of fizzled away, but now we're going to start it back up just because of the great interest that was shown there. And these programs, they have been in existence for quite some time now. So a lot of students obviously are part of them, have graduated, have been employed, and so on and so on. So again, it's a pleasure to have you be part of these specific series. And in terms of GIS, it's going to be very interesting. Obviously, with these series, we have a lot of students, either faculty or sometimes alumni, that come and join the various series that take place throughout the year. Sometimes we have a lot of new faces. Lots of folks typically are familiar with GIS, and when we define GIS, obviously there's so many different definitions of it. But of course, we always think about maps, we always think about data, we always think about the applications that we're building, the analysis we're doing. And this is this fascinating technology that gives us the ability to answer questions and address problems, solve problems. So lots of different applications. And Jim is going to talk about some of those, as well as some of the implications and things that we need to think about, just obviously as we're working with this fascinating technology. So very curious, by show of hands, how many students do we have in the group? So raise your hand in the using the control buttons. So how many students? If you can find the little hand. All right, wonderful, wonderful. Okay, what about, do we have any alumni? So go ahead and lower your hand if you're a student. So raise your hand if you're alumni. All right, Peter, wonderful to see you. Marco, wonderful to see you as well. That's great. All right, and do we have any faculty present? All right, Dan, great to see you. Wonderful, wonderful. Okay. All right. Great. So with that said, I'd like to go ahead and introduce Jim. Like I mentioned, he's been with our program now for a number of different years, and it was such a blessing when he joined us for the first time. We're looking for an instructor to launch a drones course. And Jim came to us very, very highly recommended, plethora of experience, and it was the most wonderful journey that he's had as part of our programs. It's an absolute pleasure working, collaborating with him because of his vast experience that joins and that bridges many, many different sectors between academia, government, private, public sector. Jim does so many things. And one of the most wonderful things that he does is just the way he collaborates with all of our students. He's created so many opportunities for our students. He doesn't just teach our drones classes, but he does a lot of the capstone facilitation work. He takes students in the field, and it's absolutely wonderful. It's a pleasure to have Jim here today as a speaker. So with that said, Jim, I'm going to pass it over to you. And like I said, I'll let you, if you want to say a little bit more about yourself as a way of introduction, please feel free. But we'll go through Jim's presentation, and then as we go along, think of questions or just ask those questions either via chat or the Q&A as well. So I'm going to stop my share, and Jim, I'll let you take it over.
Great, thanks, Jerry. Hi, everybody. Glad you're here. Let me start out by just saying that this thing called the Laser Lab is really a virtual thing. There's no physical space on any campus that has a lab room, but we have warehouses in Florida and Virginia, and we have the Hopkins equipment that we take all in the field wherever we go. So it's kind of a virtual traveling lab, kind of like a circus or a gypsy show. What's really neat about it, though, is that you get to apply your tradecraft in a bunch of different areas. So if you take any of the courses that are part of the Laser Lab program or the GIS specific courses that lead to capstones, lots of opportunities. I'll talk about those a little bit on the back end here. So 4 years ago, I presented in this series, April of 2022, so I guess 3.5 years ago. And we put this slide up, and we said that our core competencies were going to be spatial density, temporal density, and then getting to places that humans can't get to in order to collect the data. So that's all the grayed out stuff. Now that's all happening pretty smoothly. Almost anyone with a little bit of training and some understanding in sciences can take a drone out, fly it, take a submarine out, use sonar, any type of robotic, and collect data. What we said back then, and I really kind of said it's an issue then, but I knew it was going to become more of an issue, is this whole idea of putting your data into an algorithm-driven mill of some sort, and it crunches the data and gives you back a really nice looking result. So let's talk in terms, very specific terms, so this makes some sense. For GIS, if we fly a map with our drone and we collect 700 pictures, we take those pictures and we push them together into a georectified orthomosaic map. That process changes the value of each pixel that you have in the end result. So while you have a bigger holistic view, that's very important, you need these, you've possibly lost or possibly changed from empirical data to some inferred or contrived data value that goes with the depth in the raster data that comes along. Now, professional companies like Esri build tools to protect that from happening, and you still have your data, it just may not be readily available. But when you push it into a cloud-based server and you pay by the byte to save it, a lot of times the empirical data goes away. So that's something that you need to guard against. And then the other piece you need to guard against is the whole, what algorithm did you use? So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight very briefly. I'm only going to show some examples of this occurring. And then we're going to open it up for questions. And specifically, I'd like to hear your questions on what techniques you use, if you have anything that you'd like to offer. So let's look at a drone flight. This is a thermal data set. So this is not pictures. This is just each pixel having a value of a temperature from the surface it was reading. So as the aircraft flew over, the thermal imager picked up with the sensor a temperature, and it presents that on a scale where dark blue or black color is cold, and the red to orange to bright white hot is the hot side. The white line is the first transect of the drone flying over this area, and each little dotted white line frame is the picture as it goes. So it's the sequential pictures. The blue frame is the frame of interest, and that's over on the right-hand side. And the target of interest is the yellow circle in the orthomosaic. That's what you're looking at in the colorful purple medical scale image there. The gray scale is the source empirical data. So the first thing I'd like you to notice is if you look at the speck in the center of the circle on the left-hand side in the colorful picture, and then you go over and look at the empirical data and look at that speck, you can clearly see sharp edges in the empirical data. And those sharp edges have been dulled or blurred using a nearest neighbor algorithm. And you've lost value, and you've certainly not gotten the exact temperature anymore for each pixel. So the result is much like the image in the upper right, where all of the little pixels that are represented in this image here, and so you can see these tiny little squares in there. Those squares are each a value in the empirical image, but when you push them together, they get interpolated or smoothed out. And that's valuable information for larger subjects that you're studying. But if you're studying small things, you're going to lose some of the indication data that you need. You also might make some assumptions that aren't true because you might have a normalized temperature. So that's just one example. That's thermal data. Now, what I want to do is take a look at one of our ongoing research program areas, and this is someplace you could be involved in if you want to. We use subsea imaging, we use sonar, we use surface boats that pick up water quality and sonar. We use drone aircraft that pick up LiDAR, thermal, multispectral, and visible light imagery. And we push it all together working on this environmental science problem that we have. And the problems that we're working on here, by the way, are subaquatic vegetation, which is critical to habitat, shoreline erosion, and biomass calculations on shoreline mangroves. So those are the three things we're working on, and that's why we have all those different sensors run. When you take a look at something at this scale with a satellite image, you're going to run into what's in this red box down here, which is going to be mostly classification errors. All of these green shaded areas and all of the crosshatched and green areas offshore are an attempt by a classification algorithm to indicate whether we're seeing subaquatic vegetation or bare underwater surface areas. So this is one of those cases where the resolution of the imagery doesn't support the science that needs to be performed, yet the software doesn't know that, so it goes ahead and classifies it, even though it's pretty wrong. I mean, this chart didn't validate at all when you actually went out there and looked to see what was there. So that's one of the problems with these tools, because you subscribe to these portals, you push the data into the portal, and you get back a nice looking chart that has all these classifications on it, or segmentations, or some other interim step in the analysis, but it's wrong. But you have no way of knowing it because you didn't retain the empirical data, where you could then go down to the pixel and check it and see. So that is something that we've been working pretty hard on in the laser lab to enable, and we do that a lot with our student involvement. So these are picture dots. Each of these dots is a place where a 4K picture was taken at 30 meters above the surface. So the empirical imagery gives us a ground sample distance of around 1 centimeter per pixel, as opposed to around 3 meters, which is what you're going to get with most of your free commercial satellite imagery. So it greatly improves the resolution, which then allows you to look at the picture and make an interpretation of what you're actually seeing. And then you can teach that to the classification algorithm and tune or empirically force the algorithm to follow the empirical data that you collected, the truth data that you collected. Again, all this done without going out there and physically walking around. That's always a possibility in this case, but in some places you can't do that. What's really nice about all this is you can share it, and you can share it remotely over Zoom or Teams or some other sharing tool. You can stream the imagery and the flight operations or the boat operations live. So people can be remotely participating as scientists, engineers, geographers, and giving you their input, and you can expand your subject matter expertise so that your empirical interpretations are better peer review than just your opinion. So, and that's not only an academic activity, that's a scientific activity. So here's what it might look like when you actually render it out in a 3D model. And you can see little tiny dots in this white box here. And these little tiny dots give you the ability to actually see what you would see if you were kayaking over this area. Everything that's in the light shaded green is underwater, and it's roughly a meter underwater. So you can't see the water here because we process that out, which is nice because now we've got empirical data of what we're really studying. And then it makes a three-dimensional model, so you can calculate biomass volumes, and you can calculate things like changes in vertical height or changes in area of a plant species or whatever you're studying. All of this, again, done through digital files, web portals, and shareable. Now, here's the problem. This is a real big problem. When you actually process the empirical image, so this is one picture right here with an edge of another picture. That's the black edge, and I've kind of taken that out. So this is two pictures pushed together and overlapping each other, as you would normally get when you're flying an aircraft taking pictures. You're taking a picture every couple seconds, and you're getting overlap as you fly, so that the same pixel shows up, or the same subject in the picture shows up in multiple different pictures. And when you push them together, the algorithm has to say, well, which one are we going to consider to be the most accurate? And are we going to weight that, or are we going to give them all the even amount of weight? So when the algorithm gets confused, it kind of looks like what's going on in this white box. And over in the lower right-hand corner of this box, you can see good resolution, and you could clearly see little scouring going on underwater there. And you can see some benthic material, if you know really what you're looking at. Some grass is there as well, maybe even some algae. But the detritus is the dark stuff. It's basically the plant material that's decaying along the shoreline. It's heavier than the water, so it's sitting down on the bottom. Over to the left-hand side of that white box, you can see that the pixelation has made it giant. Big, huge splats of answers. And of course, those answers are wrong because we should be looking at tiny little pixels, a centimeter by a centimeter on the bottom. And what we're seeing is just the algorithm didn't know what to do. So it just kind of colored it. And it made this weird shaped fractal or Gaussian splat type of display. So that's what's going on. And if you were to zoom out on this map and look at it on scale, like a kilometer by a kilometer scale, you wouldn't see those splats. You would just see it as a value, and you wouldn't know that that component or that area of your image is not usable. It's scientifically incorrect. So that's the kind of thing that you want to play with. So what are the science and technical needs, the knowledge, skills, and abilities that you need in order to address this problem? You definitely need to understand what happens when you're doing GIS work and you work to improve spatial density. That means in simple terms, it would be improving your ground sample distance and making it smaller, but it also means getting more vertical information. And typically in GIS in the 20 years leading up to the last 10, everything's been kind of 2D, but now we've got great 3D capabilities. And so you have to kind of think about how do you get that third dimension. Temporal density, that's the frequency of your data collection. And so you want to pay attention to how often should you do it. Well, then you run up against a different statistical issue is how do you weight it? The thermal image that I showed you earlier, I flew over that drain field 3 days ago. Then they mowed it flat. Then I flew over it again. Then they turned on the septic system drain system to flood the zones so that if there were any leaks, it would create much more saturation in the soil and possibly even create standing water or standing effluent. And then we flew it again, and we wanted to compare those. So the spatial density would be fly low and get really small little pixels so you can actually get really accurate measurements. Fly temporal density increased by flying every morning and then every afternoon so that you have no sun illumination, thermal. So what are you looking for there? Warm water on a cold surface because the effluent's coming out at house temperature. Then in the afternoon, it's the reverse. Now you're looking for cooler water with hot ground surface heated by solar. So you have to know all that stuff. That's the first two bullets. Then you have to be pretty crafty about how to go out and actually get this without interfering with your environment. One of the big mistakes most environmental scientists make until they're trained properly is you don't want to be measuring the impact of yourself measuring. All right. You don't want to be walking around and then all of a sudden find out that your movement is what's causing the animal behaviors. Okay. Those kind of things. And of course, you don't want to do anything that's going to damage the environment. You don't want to do anything that's going to hurt any humans or animals, living creatures, or the core environment. So you got to think about, do we use a robot to get the sensor out there to go get the data? Is that less intrusive? And then you got to talk to other experts in other fields. If you hold a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. Put down the hammer. Find out what the environmental activists have to say about your subaquatic vegetation. Go talk to the people who are fishing the waters, the professional watermen. Talk to the people who live there. It's not just about what can I do with this from a GIS perspective. Broaden your horizons of experience by talking to experts in other areas. Sometimes it's not what they tell you, it's that they get you looking at the problem differently. And that's always a good thing. And then the bottom line is be careful when you use AI-based processing, especially these portal-based tools, because they're not going to tell you the algorithm. They're not going to tell you how they figured out which temperature to use when you had this target showed up in 23 pictures, and they put those 23 pictures together as a key point to make the mosaic, and they gave it a temperature value for the target. They're not going to tell you how they arrived at that temperature. So that's ultimately what you got to really guard against right now. There's this big buzz on just use portal processing, use AI, move ahead to information and start making decisions. And that's not always a good thing. GIS is the glue. I've said this many times. You know, we've got the science of where, which is the tagline at Esri, which is actually very appropriate because where things occur and when they occur is almost always going to be tied to the causal or contributing factors. So it's pretty important to have some idea about where. When you talk to a straight up seasoned professional, they're going to tell you what their field experience is, and don't ignore that as well. And one of the easiest ways to get them engaged is show them a map. Show them a map with some data layers on it. Maybe a digital map so they can turn the layers on and off and say, well, what if I did this or what if I did that? Those kind of engagements really get those people talking to you, and that's how you're going to find out a little bit more about what's really happening in your environment or in your mapped area. Ways to engage. Gary Miller told us a few ideas here, and I'm always looking for people that want to do this. You can take drones one, and if you want to actually fly a drone that belongs to Johns Hopkins, you have to take that class because you have to be certified. So that's a bogey if you want to do that. But you may say, let somebody else fly the drone and get me the data. I'm more interested in the data information loop, or I'm more interested in the scientific assessment or the engineering assessment. So you may not want to do that. You may want to do a capstone and use the data that others have collected. You may be interested in ground robots and in bird classification audio robots that we sit out in the environment, or sonar on boats, or driving a submarine and picking up water samples from deep aquatic environments. Then take drones too. And if you want to go in the field and just play with all this stuff, but you really don't really know what you want to do exactly, but you think it's cool and it's something you want to learn to do, then sign up for an expedition. And, you know, it's kind of like it's almost like an eco technology expedition. You'll learn to use this stuff. Other students will fly it for you. Other students will drive it. You'll get a lot of experience, but without having to go through the actual academic course. And that's a good way to get involved. So with that, if you have any questions or contacts that aren't going to be answered tonight, you need to reach out to me. You can email me at my email at Hopkins, and I'd be glad to interact with you.
All right, wonderful, fascinating, Jim. Absolutely wonderful. So many great snippets of information in there. Obviously, lots of different ways to engage, as you pointed out. So thank you for nicely detailing those. I particularly like the mention of get out there and talk to other people, fishermen that work these waters or people that live there, and kind of get that different view of things. So, some of that advice is just absolutely priceless. But with that said, let's go ahead and open it up for questions, and feel free to type them in the chat, as well as leverage the Q&A tool to be able to ask your questions. And it looks like we have one question coming up. Could you briefly explain how the Drones 1 course works, and when would the portion take place?
Sure. So the drones course to certify is broken down into 3 pieces. The first piece, or the first third of the course, is taught through interaction, Zoom, real time, with some extra work on your part to go past the federal aviation exam for remote pilot. The second third of the course is discussing the science and how we're going to collect the data. So it has to do with planning your missions, what kind of sensors, how are you going to get all this data to process into the tools, and it introduces the tools of the trade. The third and final part of the course is coming to the field and operating the aircraft and collecting the data, and that's taught in the Washington, D.C. area. And it's a Tuesday through Friday, 9 to 5. All in 1 week, so 4 days in a row. And then you basically summarize your data in a story map. So it's a fancy PowerPoint, but with mapping specific tools in it. And that's published across the Hopkins community. And then we pick some of those to actually share to Esri, to share across Esri. So that's how the course is laid out.
And I'll just add also that it's a wonderful opportunity to, if you're not in the Baltimore, D.C. area, to obviously come to this area. Lots of students do come from whatever your geographic location is where you live, and just to visit campus, meet some of your fellow students in the GIS program. As we know, it's a fully online program, so you don't get to in-person interact. So in addition to everything Jim described, it's the one and only course in the program that actually gives you the ability to have that sort of in-person interaction.
Yeah, and a lot of students will come on the weekend before the class, and they'll go poke around in Baltimore and go see Hopkins, and pick up some logo Gucci wear to wear during the field week and the class picture and all that kind of thing. And if it's something that they organize, occasionally I'll go up there and give tours and kind of show you what's going on. And weekends are pretty cool in Baltimore. There's a lot going on. And then other students do the same thing, and they stay and they go on that weekend, or they'll go to Washington, D.C. to see the sites. So if you're not local to the area, do make it worth the effort. All right. Flight school is a blast. It's not hard. The hardest part of the class is the first third. You pass the FAA test, and the rest of it is gravy train. It's easy. Okay. And it's fun. All right. Marco, you asked about algorithms. So there are none that are readily accepted in the community as being the best. So I don't want to imply the best, but the one that you're going to see the most in this type of data is called the nearest neighbor algorithm. And generally, when you're dealing with pixels in an image, think of it like a tic-tac-toe board. You find the edge of the thing you want to study. So let's say that it's a 1 foot diameter plastic manhole in a drain field, and you want to see if it's got a crack in it. So you have to figure out, how am I going to see that manhole cover at that size and the crack? So you figure out your altitude first, because that's what tells you your resolution of your imagery. Then you have to recognize that when you put that into an orthomosaic, you're going to cut the resolution by you're going to cut it down to 1/9 of what it was. So if you had a 9 centimeter resolution flown at, say, 400 feet, you're going to end up with, something like 81 centimeters is how big the object would be before the algorithms that can do object analysis and classification will work. So first pick your altitude. And if you pick a very low altitude with a high resolution, low ground sample distance, you can tolerate that rule of 9 and do nearest neighbor and it'll work. But you have to tell the nearest neighbor algorithm only use directly adjacent pixels. Don't go out like 20 pixels out for nearest neighbor, like I showed you in the example. Stay close to home so that the edge doesn't get too fuzzy. So that's kind of the way that pictures are being processed. And there's other algorithms for other types of data. LiDAR data uses a different algorithm, uses a K-clustering algorithm. That's generally accepted as one of the better strategies there. Okay, let's see. Chloe has drones too. Oh yeah, drones too is in person. We bring this giant trailer full of all kinds of robotics and sensors and stuff. So you do a Zoom class, and then we all meet at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center in Maryland. And we're hosted by the Smithsonian, and they have all these scientific problem sets that they're doing on land, ranging from architecture, archaeology, environmental science, tree forestry work, water quality, underwater oyster reef mapping. I mean, if you're into environmental science, that's the place to go. And so you go there, and then you run all the different robots throughout the class. So you learn how to run subs, boats, rovers, physically planted, body-worn robotics, flying drone type robotics.
It's absolutely amazing, just amazing opportunities that, again, Jim provides to our students. And like Marco said, if I was only a student, and sometimes I wish that too, if I was only a student.
jh.edu, Marco. AAP.
There you go.
Come on, join us. We'd love to have you.
Again.
Yeah, well, there's got to be something he hasn't studied yet.
There you go. There you go.
All right.
All right.
Anybody else to ask any questions?
Any other thoughts that anyone in the group has? Feel free to type them. I have one question, Jim.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting that, some of the way technology has evolved, that's just absolutely fascinating. And the more and more with some of these tools, foundational knowledge and concepts is needed to be able to run the tools, to figure out what tool to run, how to accurately interpret the results, see if, the data is right, et cetera, et cetera. And you spoke a little bit to the various competencies that are needed. So there's a GIS competency that you mentioned, a couple of remote sensing competencies as well. But if somebody's not really truly familiar or doesn't have some of those foundational concepts, then what does that mean? They shouldn't run the tools, shouldn't try to attempt to do some of this work? How does one, and even from an instructor perspective, what approach do you take to sort of bridge the gap and ensure that that foundational knowledge is there?
All right. Well, Jerry, you know this, and all my cohort faculty know this, that I'm a half full guy. So I'm never going to say anything that's going to make you say, no, you can't run the tools. Run the tools. But that was the other half of my caution was, if you run these tools and you aren't dead sure that you've got verified truth in your answers, you need to have a good network of people that's outside of your core little Rolodex of expertise, because they're going to see the same things that you see, and they're going to see the right answers and the wrong answers the same way, probably. So you need to expand out and get peers to look at it in other disciplines and say, well, that doesn't make sense. How could that be? And it doesn't mean highly educated. It means experienced people who have experienced asking and answering that question for that environment, that setting. So use the tools. And the reason I say that it's okay to do that, even though I'm cautioning, that's kind of the whole lecture or the whole point of tonight's talk, is you got to be really careful about these tools, because you're going to think you're getting something that's really good and really truthful. But those conversations lead you to people that will say, I use this other tool, and you might not even know about it. So sometimes it's not getting the answers, it's just getting a different view on the problem, and you learn about different tools. I don't know how many of you that are on this session tonight have iPhones, but if you have an iPhone that has a LiDAR distance focus capability, you have the ability to make your own LiDAR maps with a free piece of software right off the App Store called Polycam. And you can make really cool LiDAR maps. Okay, great, nice. That might win you a free cup of coffee at Starbucks or something like that. Who can make a better map contest? Where can you really use that in the real world? What if you had a little car accident? You want to make a really good 3D model of what happened. What if you're doing environmental science research and you're on a kayak and you kayak up against a giant mangrove canal and you want to kind of map it so that you can take measurements? What if you're doing shoreline erosion and you want to know how scoured the under part shelf of the oyster bed is, but you don't want to have to walk all over it, or it says no trespassing, or it's private property? You can make these little LiDAR map models that are 3D, and then you can bring them back on your phone and you can measure on them and calculate volumes and take a look at all the empirical pictures it took. Awesome tool, free. You know where I found out about that? A sports coach. A sports coach. He was using it to model golfers when they were swinging.
Interesting.
So talk to people outside your circle.
It's amazing.
But
Amazing what kind of uses
tools.
to apply. Yeah.
Yeah, use the tools. Just be careful. Don't just jump to the conclusion that the tool tells you the answer is.
Mm-hmm.
How many, I'd be interested to know how many people in the attendees own some sort of a drone, something that can fly, just out of curiosity.
Maybe raise your hand or type in the chat.
Okay.
So Becca does.
Because that's one of the things. So I only see one that's actually voted. So that's interesting, because there's 1.3 million drones registered in the United States, and that means there's probably at least twice that many. And there's 345,000 or so remote pilots who've been certified. Now, not all are current, but it's an easy thing to get recurrent on. It's not like flying an occupied aircraft. So it's kind of surprising, but maybe that's why you're here. Maybe you're thinking about it. You saw us, the drones dude, and you want to come to the session and see if drones are for you. It's a really great tool for a lot of purposes, and you're seeing a lot of it in media. You'll see it in the movies constantly. You'll see it on TV, in news gathering. You'll see it in real estate. So it's a very useful tool. Environmental scientists should know how to fly drones. It's a super important part of our job, right? Is to measure and assess things and try to stay remote. I do bird studies on wildlife that I have to be very careful around, like ospreys and other birds of prey. And drones are really great for that. Really great, because the only other alternatives to see what's going on and take measurements of things in the nest, like size of eggs and stuff, is to climb up there. And that's, not only does that require a lot of permitting, but it's dangerous and it's harmful to the animal. So interesting. And I see somebody said in the chat that their company has a drone. A lot of our graduates from our program have made it into an environmental science job or a GIS job because they could fly a drone. It's a resume bullet that gets attention when you go for interviews.
Absolutely, it does. Absolutely. So highlighting that point specifically as well.
Yeah, for those that remember the bridge collapse in Baltimore earlier this year, we have a student who was in our program in 2021 and 22 timeframe, and she's responsible for operating the drone data collection program for the reconstruction of the bridge. I don't think she's going to fly it because she's moved up in her career to a point where she's leading that team, and I think she's going to use drone pilots that she's hiring. But it just shows you that in a few years, her drone experience was significant enough that she could lead a group of people to do that. And that's pretty complicated flying out over the water from a boat around a bridge and cranes. That's, interesting flying.
Amazing. Yeah, just the idea of democratization of drones, like that they can be used for so many personal uses, to your point of studying birds or whatever it may be. And I I like fishing. So actually taking the drone to be able to cast farther, it's a no-brainer, right? So again,
Yeah.
it's like
So there are a few states where you can't use a drone in any form of hunting or fishing, and North
yeah.
Carolina is the closest to us here. But if you watch a lot of sports, outdoor sports, you'll see drones used a lot. They're using drones for target spotting and shooting sports so that they don't have to go down range, and it keeps the range safer, and they can fire, shoot more. They're using it for following fishermen while they're fishing to film, because you can see through the angle of incidence down into the water. And so you can see the fish that you can't see when you're shooting with a camera on a boat. I flew last November. I flew in the National Professional Bull Riders Championship. I flew a drone in the arena while they were riding the bulls, and got really cool shots of people riding the bulls in the arena, during where nobody else would be, right? It's the bull and the rider and the people on the safety riders on the horses, and me with the drone giving people a view that they couldn't get any other way.
Yeah.
So you never know where you're going to be asked to fly.
Right. It's an amazing skill.
Yeah, it was fun. You have to be careful when you do operate these, and that's why the course is so important. There are rules, and everybody should know that.
Absolutely. I do have one other question, Jim. We always, particularly when it comes to some of these AI tools, the recommendation has been to use smaller data sets as a proof of concept to be able to at least test something before kind of doing it on your whole entire study area. In your experience, do you suggest that? Do you advise that? Have you observed that?
I do. Now, smaller just means what is the minimum set that's going to give you the confidence interval that you need from the tool you're using. So if you're using a tool like I was using for the thermal, I flew the field in one high level map, 700 pictures. That's not enough for the classification algorithm that I wanted to use. It requires 1,000 pictures minimum. And minimum means not high confidence in the result. So small is for the image analysis tools, small on mosaics is going to be in the 1,000 to 10,000 range is what I'm finding. But and Esri, of course, leading the pack usually, and in this case, absolutely. For a survey I just did yesterday of a road that has cracks in it, I wanted to know what's the linear crack distances in the road. So I needed a tool that could look at the pictures, not a mosaic, and take each picture and tell me the length of the cracks. Then when I pushed the mosaic together, I needed to retain the crack data as metadata, so I didn't have duplicate crack count being added up. That only took about 60 pictures to train that tool.
That's great.
Yeah.
Interesting. Very
So
interesting.
sometimes the data set can be very small.
Yeah.
Am I a fan of it? Well, sure, because if you got to go to the field and collect 10,000 pictures and you get back and you find out that you didn't do the collection correctly, you didn't fly the right altitude, or you didn't fly the right sun angles or the right wind angles, you're better off wading into the water than diving in if you don't know what's under it.
Yeah.
So pick a tool, find out what its minimum data set is for a reasonable confidence interval. Generally, we want to make sure that when we get a result that we're getting a kind of 80% sure that this result is what you asked for. And you kind of look at the tools literature, and it'll tell you how many pictures you need to reach a certain confidence interval to train it. And then also try to train your tools in a way that you can be sure that you know the right answer before you get the answer. That's your verification device right there.
There, the human eye still needs to have, obviously the final answer, and the scrutiny of the result is absolutely important.
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. So, any other questions by the group, or Jim, did you have any other questions for the audience here, or anything else you'd like to share?
I think I appreciate them voting on who owns the drones. That was an interesting answer. It may be an artifact of who's attending, but I would have expected more. For those of you that are interested in them, don't be shy, right? As long as you're not using it for a commercial purpose, you can buy one and practice flying it. I wouldn't, go flying out. You certainly can't fly over people and cars and stuff, but if somebody wants to ask me a question about drones privately through the email, feel free. And that's, almost always the best way to get into flying is to talk to a flight instructor, and that's me.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right. Well, with that, thank you. Thanks again, Jim, for sharing your
pleasure.
experience. It's always a pleasure learning from you, listening to you, and just seeing the wonderful things that you do. It's always amazing and always something to learn. So thank you again for joining us tonight.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank